Okay, so welcome back. This lecture actually this week's going to be a little bit truncated because what I'm going to do first is actually talk about the book review assignment, which is of course due Saturday, July 25th at 5 p.m. on Quarkus. So I'm just going to go over a little bit about what's expected, what the difference between a book review and a book report is, how to think about it, things to look for in the book, and that kind of thing. So first, let's go over some kind of general information. So the book review assignment, obviously you're selecting your book from, and most of you hopefully have selected your book already, selected from the 4 books that are given on the syllabus. And what we're expecting is about 3 to 5 pages, double-spaced. And as I said, it's due digitally on Saturday, the 25th of July on Quarkus. You submit it in the same way that you submitted your midterm. And same thing with your name written into the file. And make sure you submit it as a Word document, not a PDF. Do not submit it as a PDF. It's just if you submit it as a PDF, it's hard for us to actually track the changes and mark it up and write things on it. You'll just get a lot more comments if you do it that way. And of course, first, what you have to actually do is complete the book review worksheet, which I will go over in a few minutes, and the assignment itself. Now, I'm just briefly going to go over some things here. One of the things you want to do is you need to summarize the book's thesis or argument. Okay. Now, once I talk about the individual things you have to do, I'm going to talk more about what the difference between a book review and a book report is. So you want to comment on the way the author engages with the historiography on the topic at hand. That is, the way the author discusses debates and controversies within the field. So, for example, if you're reading a book about let's say the Ed Baptiste one. If you're reading a book about, in that case, looking at the connection between capitalism and slavery, you want to identify the debates that that book is engaging with, controversies in the field. For that one, of course, as most of you have probably guessed, and those of you who are reading it probably have noticed, is that issue of what slavery's role in capitalism actually is, right? So in that particular book, you would want to identify what those debates are. What other historians or theorists is the author arguing against or in favor of, that kind of thing. You want to critically assess the volume's findings. Now, this is a key thing that makes a book review assignment different than a book report. In a book report, that you did in high school, you're essentially just being asked to regurgitate content from the book. Right? Now, that's part of a book review, but what we want to know is what you think of the book. And it's not just, did you like it or not like it? It has to be an argument about the book. You're critically assessing the volume's findings. You want to explore the ways that the author also touches upon the concepts and themes that we have explored in history. This is an old one. It should be History A09. Where possible, you should refer to specific assigned course readings and lectures. So, for example, if you're looking at the book on, say, slavery and capitalism, then obviously you should be connecting a lot of the arguments and debates in that book to the lecture we had on slavery and capitalism and its role within the history of capitalism. If you're looking at, say, the Sidney Mintz book as well, where he's talking about the history of sugar, well, you probably want to connect that book to the discussion we had and the lecture we had on the state imperial expansion. I'm not going to get into it for you, but you probably know where I'm going with this. Now, the book Behemoth, which is about the sort of rise of the factory system, well, that one you'll probably want to connect to lectures that deal specifically with the rise of the factory system and things that we've talked about. But also, you want to connect it to key concepts as well, right? So, for example, if you're reading a book that deals with that, then where does concepts like division of labor fit in, right? Where does liberal thought fit in with these books? This is a lot of what you're looking at. Now, what we might do now, just before I get into some more stuff here, is just go over a little bit the actual worksheet in a few minutes. But before we get there, I just want to go over some of the things that is expected as well. You want to think about this assignment really as it's an essay about the book. It's not a report about the book, right? You're writing an essay about the book. And that's how you have to think of it, really. All right, let's go to the actual book review assignment here. Okay, so here's the book review assignment, you can see. So hopefully you've actually decided on a book. I would argue or suggest that you probably should have read the book. Maybe you don't necessarily have to be finished right now, but definitely have this book finished by the end of the week, because if the assignment is due next Saturday, July 25th, I would give yourself at least a week to actually write this assignment. It is only 3 to 5 pages, so it's not long, but that also means those 3 to 5 pages really need to count in terms of your editing and how tight the book review assignment should be, right? Because you don't have a lot of space, everything that you put into it has to count. It has to be, it has to be good. It has to be well written. It has to be well structured and well argued and that kind of thing. So things that you want to look for in the book, and I'll go over this a little bit more. Again, this is a little bit of repetition, but I think it's necessary considering a lot of you had questions about what the book review assignment actually is. So as we said earlier, right? One of the things that you have to do is summarize the book's main thesis, okay? And that's where the worksheet comes in, right? So if we look at the worksheet here, right? As you've been reading the book, hopefully you've been trying to fill in this worksheet. So let's look here, okay? So you want to write down the author, the title, the publication data, and then, in 2 to 3 sentences, what is the author's main argument? Okay, all of these books have theses and they have arguments. You want to try to figure out what it is, right? What is the author actually arguing? And this is another thing to consider. So what sources does the author rely upon to make their argument? How does the author engage with scholars who have written before? We've gone over this a little bit, but you want to look at their sources. What are they using? What kind of records are they using? How might those sources shape their argument? How might those sources affect the way you think about their argument? Does it strengthen their argument? Are these sources reliable? Are these sources ideal for making the kind of argument that they're making? And again, in the worksheet, just to echo things I said earlier, you want to jot down how this book relates to the subject of our course, which specific lectures or readings you find or echo, or is there contradictions in the book? And the other thing you want to do, and this is especially important with a book review, is you want to talk about what the weaknesses in the author's argument are, as well as its strength. Right? When you think about reviewing something, it's not just about finding fault with it, that's part of it, but it's also assessing what the book does well and what it doesn't do well. So for example, if you've identified the thesis, a question to ask yourself by the end of the book is, well, does the author's thesis hold up? Are you convinced by what the author is actually arguing? These are all things to consider, right? And this is a case where I think it's really important for you to trust your judgment here, right? Sometimes when you're reading something, and I think this is especially true in first year, although to be honest, it never really goes away. Sometimes when you're reading something and you don't understand it, I think our kind of first thought is like, oh, I don't understand it. Well, maybe you're not understanding it because the argument doesn't actually work in that particular context, right? Or maybe there's an element of the argument that you're just not fully understanding. And maybe it means that it's not that you're not understanding it, it's that maybe the author is not doing a good job explaining that aspect of the argument. Or maybe the question you have at the back of your head is really your mind saying, this doesn't make sense, I have more questions. And whenever you have more questions, when an argument is being offered, that is kind of the beginning or the way into a critique of the book, right? Why do you have those questions? Why did that leave you thinking that, right? That's a number of ways to assess the weaknesses of an author's argument, right? The thing you want to just ask yourself by the end of the book is, are you convinced, right? Every single one of these books is going to make an argument about something, right? The first thing you have to do in order to assess it is identify that argument. But then you take it further, and hopefully by the end of the book, you're either going to be convinced or you're not convinced. Now, in reality, it's probably not one or the other. In most cases, you'll probably be convinced by a lot of the argument, and maybe there's other parts of the argument that you thought were, lacking or didn't quite live up to the thesis that was presented at the beginning of the book. So these are all things to consider when you're actually reading this book. Now, let's just go back to the book review assignment page here. I've gone over this. Now, if you want some specific examples, there's actually 2 sample book reviews that you can read on here, provided by Professor Rick Halpern. So the first one is actually a review written by Professor Halpern, and he's reviewing a book called Desegregating the Dollar, African American Consumerism in the 20th Century by Robert E. Weems in the Economic History Review. So this is an example of a book review. And then the other example of a book review is actually another historian historian reviewing a book by Professor Rick Halpern and Roger Horowitz, which was called Meatpackers, An Oral History of Black Packing House Workers and Their Struggle for Racial and Economic Equality. Okay, so what you'll notice about these book reviews is when you read over them, I wouldn't read more than these ones because it can get confusing. But if you just look at these two examples, it'll give you a sense of what is in these book reviews. The reason a book review is important in the context of scholarship and in the context of historians writing about history is that there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of books that are published on a particular subject every year, right? And you can't always read all of them. So one of the things that journals do, right, in this case, we've got the Economic History Review and the Oral History Review, these two reviews from 1999 and 2001. What these journals do is they provide reviews written by other historians about new books. And the reason they do that is so if I'm a historian reading, let's say, the Economic History Review, well, I look at a book and I think, oh, that might be worth reading. Okay, so then what I do is I read the book review. Now, I might, from the book review, decide to read the book, or at least decide to be aware of the book, that if I pursue an avenue of research that intersects with what that book talks about, I'm aware of what the book is essentially about and whether or not I need to read it or not. So this is a lot of what a book review is doing, and this is why critical assessment of it is really important. I'm just going to go over a few other things in terms of the mechanics of actually writing the book review. So this is a lot of what is actually expected of you, and again, I strongly recommend that you rely on, and it's a requirement of the assignment, to turn in this worksheet with the assignment. So if we go back to our slideshow here, let's see, okay. So I'm just going to leave this up and just talk to you a little bit more about essay writing in general. This is a first-year course, so some of you may have written essays in high school, many of you maybe are in second year and have had some experience, and I know a lot of you are, say, from science or management who may have had experience writing essays or not, although if you did have experience with it, it would be in a very different context. So I'm just going to go over what's expected in terms of a history essay. So, as I said, it's not just a book report, it's a book review, right? You are expected to have an argument. The book review assignment, just like the book you're reviewing, has to have a thesis that makes an argument about the book, okay? It has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. Now what that means is it has to have an introduction that introduces the book, and it introduces what it's about, and it introduces what your thesis or your argument is about that book, okay? Then you have to have a middle, which is body points, if you remember from, you know, say a high school history class, or for those of you that have, are in second year or above, right? It has to have an intro, body paragraphs, and a conclusion. Now, the body is really where you're making your argument about this book, where you're critically assessing this book. And you have to make sure you cover all the things that are summarized here, right? You have to talk about what the thesis is. You have to comment on how the author engages with the historiography, what methodology they're using. And what methodology means is like what school of thought they're looking at, right? So for example, if a book is written from a Marxist perspective, that's a form of methodology or a philosophical way of looking at it. If a book uses a particular sort of is it different discipline. So for example, if we look at the four books, Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz, for example, Sidney Mintz is actually an anthropologist, not a historian. So his methodology will be a little bit different, and you'll probably find the difference when you look at the sources he actually uses. If we look at the Naomi Klein book, right, it's a different kind of book. On the one hand, Naomi Klein is a celebrated author and activist, but she's not writing for an academic audience in the same way that, say, Sidney Mintz is, or Ed Baptiste is, or the Behemoth book is, right? Those three books are mostly aimed at an academic audience, right? So the people that were initially reading the book by Sidney Mintz would have been other anthropologists, other professors, other historians. The Naomi Klein book is a little bit different in the sense that she's writing for a much more popular audience, right? She's writing for anybody to be able to read it, right? So it might be a little bit more accessible in that sense, right? It's just a different audience. It doesn't mean it's better or worse, it's just different. So that's some things to consider when you assess these books. That Naomi Klein might be using a different methodology because her audience is different. She's not writing for other academics. She's writing for, ideally, anybody who wants to learn about her theory of how capitalism functions in the late 20th and early 21st century. Okay. If we look at the Freeman book, Behemoth, I would suggest for those of you reading it, don't get overwhelmed by the detail. There is a thesis in there about the factory system and modernity, but it's very easy in these books to get overwhelmed by the detail, especially that one. So be very conscious when you're reading through Behemoth to really try to isolate what the thesis is. The Ed Baptiste book is probably the easiest one to connect to our course, obviously, because he's literally talking about the role of slavery in capitalism. So these are things that you want to think of. Now, in terms of mechanics and actually writing the book review, as I said, right, you have to have a thesis, it has to have an intro, it has to have a body section, it has to have a conclusion. Now, I'm just going to go over quickly what is expected in both those sections. You want to think of an introduction of an essay, and that includes a book review, as kind of an upside-down pyramid, okay? You want to get more specific as you go through the introduction, right? So you want to start out a little bit more general, not too generalized, okay? A lot of students make the mistake of saying something, and don't ever say this, something so general like, in the history of Western civilization or in the history of capitalism. You don't want to start out that general. You want to start it a bit more specific to the topic, right? And as the introduction moves, it gets a little bit narrow and a little bit narrow and more specific. Ideally, by the end of the introduction, you've introduced what your argument about the book actually is. Now, the best book reviews will have a kind of overarching argument that ties everything together. Right? For those of you that did really well in the midterm, that's a lot of, for the students that did really well in the essay questions, you weren't just listing, well, here's all the answers to that question. You actually had an overarching argument and made an argument about, say, the crisis of late feudalism, or the role of liberal thought in the development of capitalism, or the role of slavery in capitalism. It's the same thing with the book review. You want to make an argument about this book. And again, and I keep saying this, it's an essay about the book, right? And you want to think about, you know, what would you say to somebody who has never read the book, right? What are your thoughts on it, right? You're critically engaging with the book in the same way that the author is critically engaging with debates about the topic that they're writing about. So that's basically the introduction. You also want to make sure you explain and spell out exactly how the review is going to be organized. And this is true of any essay that you write. So anytime you're writing an essay, or at least in history, you want to have what I like to call a statement of structure. And what that means is, okay, here's my argument, but here's how it's going to proceed. You want the reader to always know what's coming. You're not writing a mystery where by the end of it, your argument's revealed. You want to give it away at the beginning. And then you want to explain exactly how that argument is going to proceed by listing kind of the component parts of the argument, right? You can have a sort of overarching argument, but it's built on component parts that help make that argument. So that's what you need to do in your introduction. You need to introduce the book, you need to sort of pare it down by the end of the introductory paragraph, and probably no more than a paragraph, half a page. I wouldn't do more than that for your introduction, especially if it's 3 pages. If it's 5 pages, you could go a little longer, but no more than a page, double spaced, for your introduction. And I would say a half to a 3/4 of a page. You want that thesis at the end of the introductory paragraph, and you also want to explain exactly how the essay is going to proceed, right? Point 1, point 2, point 3, right? You don't actually say that. And it's okay to say, this review will argue, or this essay will, or this paper will argue. You never want to be, or I should say, you want to be very explicit. You don't want the reader, in this case one of the TAs or myself, grading it. You don't want us to have to try to figure out what your thesis is, right? And for those of you that have been reading the books at this point, I imagine you share the same frustration, right? It's a lot easier when an author just says, here's what this book is arguing, here's what this essay is arguing. And you want to do that in this book review. Just be very explicit. You can never be too clear. Just say it. This is what I'm arguing. And then say, here's how I'm going to argue it, which is basically a statement of structure. What comes first, what comes second, what comes third, right? You don't want the reader to be surprised by anything at that point. Now, when you move into your body section, this is where you make your individual points about the book, right? If you're say if one section is assessing the thesis, well, you have to have a point about whether or not the thesis holds up, right? What were the weaknesses of a thesis? Now, to do this, the building blocks of an essay are basically paragraphs. Now, for those of you that don't have experience in writing history essays or essays in general, the paragraph is the foundation of everything. And the paragraphs themselves have a structure, just like an essay. The key thing, and I can't emphasize this enough, the most important aspect of writing paragraphs for essays is the topic sentence, okay? Your topic sentence should be a kind of mini thesis and introduction to the paragraph that follows, whether it's a paragraph of 3 sentences or a paragraph of 5 to 6 sentences, right? Each paragraph, ideally in an essay, is advancing part of the argument, right? It is arguing something. And that first sentence, your topic sentence of your paragraph, should explain what that argument is. And then the rest of the paragraph is essentially proving it or providing evidence to support it. And then the last sentence of each paragraph should link it to the next one. It should conclude what has been said and then link that paragraph to what's going to be advanced in the next paragraph, and so on and so on and so on, okay? This is really the building blocks of an essay. I can't emphasize enough how important paragraph structure is, and having a good topic sentence, a good clear topic sentence that it basically explains everything that comes in the paragraph after, so that when you read that topic sentence, you should be able to understand everything that's going to follow, okay? And then that concluding sentence should summarize and link to the next paragraph, okay? And then you keep doing that until you get to the end of the essay, and then you have your conclusion. Now, your conclusion should simply summarize everything you said. You don't want to introduce any new information into your conclusion. You're merely just restating the thesis, right? Restating what your argument is, what your component parts of that argument are, summarizing everything you've just said, and then provide a sentence or two concluding what it all means, kind of thing, right? This is how you want to think about it. I would strongly suggest outlining your papers as well, not just with the little worksheet that we give you that you have to hand in with the paper, but having a plan of how you're moving forward. Me personally, I find it very difficult to actually start writing anything unless I have an idea of where it's going. Some people are different. Some people just like to free write and just write and see where it takes them. It's really up to you, but I would strongly suggest trying to figure out a plan before you actually start writing. That way the structure kind of builds as you go. The other thing I would mention with writing an essay is, I mean, I know for a lot of you, you're going to be writing this, you know, pretty close to the deadline. That's not what you want to do. Ideally, the way you write an essay is really in the editing. Most of all good writing is in the editing process, right? A first draft of an essay is just a first draft. So after you write that first draft, you read it over again, right? And then you edit. That's really where it all is. It's all in the editing. And this is especially important in a paper like this because it's so short, because it's only 3 to 5 pages. You want to make every word, every paragraph, every sentence count, right? Because there's just not a lot of space. It may seem like a lot of space, but it's really not, right? You're writing a 3 to 5 page essay on, say, a book that's 400 pages. Right? So you're trying to distill all of that 400 pages into 3 to 5 pages, right? It's not easy. And you have less space than you actually think you do, okay? And so make sure every word counts. And really, this is all in editing. So ideally, what you would want is to have a draft of the essay finished several days before it's actually due. And then you read it over again, and then you edit it. And then you look at, well, maybe this part should go earlier, or maybe this sentence could be rewritten, or this argument is not as clear as it could be, right? You really also want to constantly be reassessing your thesis, right? Are you proving your thesis? Is your thesis clear? You want to make it very clear. Now, ideally, and I know this is difficult for a lot of you, it was certainly difficult for me in first years, have somebody else read it. And especially have somebody else read it who knows nothing about the topic, because if they read it and can understand what it is you're arguing, then you've probably done a pretty good job. Another way to think, or at least to assess whether or not you have a coherently structured essay, is, you remember when I was talking about topic sentences? What I would suggest is go through your essay, cut and paste each topic sentence and concluding sentence of each paragraph into a separate document, and then read those topic sentences and concluding sentences. And if you read through those and it presents a fairly coherent argument that you can understand what's being said, then you've probably structured it very well. right? So organization is really, really important. The best essays are well structured and well organized. They also have to be well written. And this, again, comes down to editing. You just want to edit, edit, edit. All good writing is in editing, not just writing, right? We have this sort of romanticized notion that somebody writes and inspiration strikes them and they do a really good job and, whatever. And that's not really how it works. The example I like to give is, for those of you that are familiar with Ernest Hemingway, there's a really famous book called A Farewell to Arms that he published in 1926, I think it was. He wrote 67 different endings for that book. And when you read the book, the ending is, I'm not going to give it away, but it's a pretty devastating ending and it hits you really hard, right? But he hummed and hawed on it. It wasn't like he was struck with inspiration. He thought, this is how to end the book. He wrote 67 different endings. Now, I'm not suggesting that level of editorial, but it just goes to show you that so much of what is considered good writing and the great writers are constantly editing, just constantly editing. That's really where it all is. Now, the only other things I can possibly think of in terms of what you have to do is I just want to, again, re-emphasize the importance of having a thesis. And just like you're assessing the books to see whether or not that thesis is supported, you want to look at your own writing to look at, is the thesis supported, right? So let's go back to the slides here to see if we have anything else. So we'll go over it again. Again, 3 to 5 pages, double space, due digitally Saturday, July 25th at 5 p.m. this time. And it's due on Quarkus. You have to hand in the book review worksheet as well, which is available on Quarkus. You want to summarize the book's main thesis. You want to comment on the way the author engages with the historiography on the topic at hand, that is the discussions and debates and controversies in the field, right? Like, so for example, with Naomi Klein, whatever she's saying about capitalism, who's she responding to? Who's she arguing against? What is she arguing against? And explore the ways that the author touches on the concepts and themes we have explored in the course. And so I'll go back to the book review sheet here. The assignment quickly, just to go recap some of that. Here it is, okay. Right, so again, I would strongly recommend you read these 2 reviews. It just gives you a sense. And the reason I want you to read those 2 reviews is because it really gives you a sense of how to have an argument about a book, right? How to have a thesis about a book. And you will try to, what I would suggest you try to do in those reviews, try to look at what is being argued about the book, right? So in the first one that Professor Halpern wrote, what is he saying about that book? Like, what is his argument about this book? And the same thing for the second one, okay? So I'll leave it at that. If you guys have any questions about the book review, feel free to message me directly or your TAs as well. And I would also strongly recommend you talk to me or one of the TAs about what it is you're writing about, what you might be saying. Like, we're here to help, right? You're not just meant to do it alone. The whole point of having TAs and an instructor is for us to help you figure out what you should write, how to write it. And if you want to talk to your TAs, that's also fine. I mean, they're probably more likely the ones actually grading it. I grade some of them, but most likely it'll be your TAs grading it. So I'll leave it at that. Again, if you have any questions about the book review, feel free to email me or come to my office hours tomorrow or next week.